Growing up, Pauline Dakin always suspected that there was just something off about her family. Years later, she would find out she was right. In 1970, when she was 5 years old, her parents, Ruth and Warren, separated because her father, Warren, was a heavy drinker and he's extremely violent. When Pauline was 9, her mother told her and her brother that they were going to go on a vacation to Winnipeg. They drove all the way to Winnipeg. They went inside their new vacation home, and Ruth informed her children that they were actually never going back, and when you're old enough, I'll explain everything. But right as she was starting to feel normal, her mother told her and her brother that they needed to move right now all over again. This time they were going to go all the way to New Brunswick. Once in New Brunswick, they stayed there for many years. Fast forward to 1988, when Pauline was 23 years old, her mother called her and said, "Hey, I'd like to meet you at a motel. I'm finally ready to tell you everything about your childhood." She saw her mother waiting outside, kind of pacing around, looking very anxious. When they went inside, there was a man sitting in the middle of the room that Pauline immediately recognized. It was the reverend of their church when they used to live in Vancouver. His name was Stan Sears. Her mother explained that the reason they had to move so many times was because Pauline's father, Warren, was actually a mobster. Pauline's mother found out she had a hit put on her head. Stan also found out that he had a hit on his head because they knew about their relationship. And Pauline's mother said, after all these years, we were just tired of being in hiding, and so we've already spoken to the authorities, and they've moved us into a special witness protection program for families connected to the mob. It's referred to as entering the weird world, where basically you have agents that follow you around that are undercover, that track what you're doing and make sure there's no assassination attempt on you. She says, "Well, what happened to Dad?" Pauline's mother says, "He's in the weird world too." And so Pauline went back home, but after only a couple of days, her paranoia was so high, and she called her mother and said, "I want to join the weird world." And so Pauline's mother told her that she would be in touch with one of her agents, and they would contact Pauline when it was time for her to go. But the waiting dragged on for 5 years. Pauline started to doubt this whole mafia thing was even true. And so Pauline called her mother and very convincingly told her that, "Oh my goodness, someone just broke into my apartment. I think it was someone from the mafia. Should I call the police? What do I do?" And her mother said, "No, I'm going to get in touch with Stan and see if he knows what to do." And just a couple of minutes later, Pauline's mother called back and said, "I spoke to Stan, and he spoke to the undercover agents that sit outside your house, and they said that yes, unfortunately, not one, but 2 men from the mafia broke into your house today. But luckily, they're in custody, so you're safe now." And it was at this point that Pauline realized her mother and Stan had been living a lie since she was 5 years old. There was no mafia. Her father was not a mobster. It was all made up. Stan was suffering from something called delusion syndrome, where totally normal people have one distinct delusion. And during his relationship with Pauline's mother, he passed on his delusion to her, which is shared delusion syndrome. And they took to their graves the belief that the mafia was after them. And so even though Pauline never got an apology from her mother, Pauline ultimately made peace with the situation by writing a best-selling memoir called Run, Hide, Repeat. Check it out. In 2017, Aaron Joel was a tall, handsome, 41-year-old free spirit. He left his family home in Oklahoma and moved out to Oregon and moved into this commune. But shortly after moving in, Aaron got restless again and began traveling all over the United States. And so he left the United States and he went to Nepal and began traveling all over Nepal. He met this wonderful young woman from Switzerland named Ladina, and the two fell madly in love. In 2014, the pair got married and they bought a house together and settled down in Switzerland. But in 2017, Aaron's wanderlust reared its head again, and he settled on attending that year's Burning Man. And he goes back to Oregon in the United States, and he meets up with a very close friend of his named Justin. From there, they drive in Justin's big van. They get to Nevada, they drive out to the Burning Man site. And so by that afternoon, Aaron and Justin had made lots of new friends, and they were out partying and dancing. Towards the end of every Burning Man, they will build this 40-foot tall wooden man effigy, and they will burn it to the ground. And so on the night, their group began making their way over to the wooden man effigy. All around this wooden man are what they called rangers. They're basically security guards for the event that also have some fire training. Aaron would turn to Justin and say, "Hey, I have some friends from Switzerland who are here right now. They're on the other side of the effigy, and I'm going to go see them right now." And a little while later, when the sun had gone down, they lit the effigy. And so this huge wooden man effigy goes up in glorious flames, and everyone's so amazed by it. And then finally, when the fire is just about out, the crowd of people begin to disperse. Someone who was at the event, who apparently knew Justin and knew Aaron, came running over to Justin and frantically told him this totally shocking story about something that happened to Aaron. After Aaron told Justin that he was going to go to the other side of the crowd, and he made his way over to that far side of the crowd, but we don't know if he actually met up with friends from Switzerland. And once he was over there, he pushed his way towards the front of the crowd, and then after the effigy was set alight, at some point, Aaron was able to sprint directly into the bottom of this massive effigy, right into the fire. Aaron would ultimately only be inside of the flames for 12 seconds before the Rangers were able to go inside and pull him out. Aaron would be rushed to the hospital, but he would die that night. Aaron was completely sober at the time he decided to run into the Burning Man, and so it was determined that his death had to be a... However, his family and his friends and anybody who knew him are just totally not buying the idea that he decided to commit, especially like this. At this point, no one has come close to figuring out what this other thing could be. And so to date, his death still remains largely a mystery. Here is a picture one of the bystanders took of Aaron as he charges into the fire.
Late at night in 2006, two men hear some strange noises coming from a forest near their house, so they decide to go have a look. After their footage went completely viral, they would admit that they actually only went into the woods just to scare themselves. They didn't actually expect to film anything. At some point on their walk, they start to notice more and more dead birds on the ground, and so one of them gets out his camera to start filming them. As they're filming the birds, you can tell that they're getting more and more spooked by the whole situation, and then one of the men hears something in the tree line, and the cameraman pans his camera to look. Human eyes don't reflect light.
I've been having this recurring nightmare since I was a kid. In this dream, I'm in a brightly lit room. The room is long and narrow, and I'm standing on one end with my back to the wall. And I'm alone, or I think I'm alone. But then I blink, and I see him. There's this man standing all the way at the other end of the room. And at first glance, he's just a normal-looking guy. Brown hair, he's wearing jeans, he's got a shirt on. But something's just wrong. He's standing there, but with his back to me. And then I realize there are no doors in this room. It's like I'm trapped. And then I wake up. Now, when I was little, this nightmare used to send me running into my parents' room, hysterical. But I couldn't explain back then why the dream was scary. I mean, after all, really nothing happened. But now I know. It's the horror that lurks within the unknown. It's called the theater of the mind. We basically fill in the gaps of our knowledge with whatever terrifies us the most. The scariest monsters we could ever conceive of are the ones we actually make up in our minds. This collection is full of terrors that lie just beyond our comprehension. I just hope the theater of your mind doesn't keep you up too late when you're done. Your nightmares are waiting. MrBallen. In 2010, an avid caver named Jeff decided to go to Madagascar to explore a natural cave shaft he had discovered years earlier. When he got out to that area, he used his notebook to find the opening to the cave. It was approximately 50 meters deep and 1 meter across, so it's pretty narrow, and the first 20 meters of the descent are on a bit of an angle, and then the final 30 meters are down at a straight vertical drop. At the bottom of this cave was this opening where you could actually stand up and walk around, but there were no other tunnels to explore at the bottom, so you would just go down, touch the bottom, and go back up. So Jeff enters the cave and he makes his way down to the 20-meter mark. And he's about to make that final descent when he notices something out of the corner of his eye. And he focuses his light on the side of the shaft and he sees thousands of black widow spiders trying to escape the light. They're scattering all over the walls. On the vertical section of the shaft is covered in black widow spiders. In order to go back up this line that he was rappelling down on, he needed technical gear. And his technical gear was packed in his backpack, and it would just be totally unsafe trying to fish it out of his bag. And so he would have to descend the final 30 meters, then take his pack off, get the gear out, and go back up. So Jeff took a deep breath and he began his slow, awful descent into this cave filled with spiders. And periodically, as he would bump into the wall, he'd hear them scatter all over the walls, and then he saw them climbing on his sleeves, and he'd have to brush them off his sleeves. Finally gets to the bottom, and he can hear the spiders on the wall just crawling all over the place. He takes his bag off, and it's covered in spiders. He opens it up, spiders crawl out of his bag. He carefully reaches in and pulls out his technical gear. He throws it up, and he begins making his way back up, and the whole time he just brushes spiders off of him. Once he gets to the surface, the first thing he does is he strips all of his clothing off. He takes his bag like dumps it out, more spiders are in there. He redresses and gets in the car. And he takes his notebook out and he scratches off the title he had given this cave from the last time he was here, which was the Crooked Tube. And on top of it, he writes, "The Entrance to Hell." In 1993, David Lewis was an accomplished lawyer living in Amarillo, Texas, with his wife Karen and his 9-year-old daughter. On January 28th of that year, Karen and their daughter decided to leave Amarillo and go to Dallas to spend the weekend shopping together. David, who would normally go with them, decided to stay home because he did not want to miss the Super Bowl, which was that Sunday, the 31st. So Karen and their daughter left, and then a couple of days later, on the 31st, they returned to Amarillo. But when they walked in, Karen noticed that the VCR was actually still recording, and so clearly he had not turned off the recording. As Karen walked around the house yelling for her husband, she wasn't that concerned. She figured he must have stepped out or something, but turned around and on the counter in the kitchen was his wedding band and his watch. And so even though there were all these kind of strange things that Karen was finding in the house, she really wasn't that concerned. There was no sign of forced entry. There was no sign the house had been burglarized. There was no sign of a struggle. And so she assumed her husband must have stepped out to watch the second half of the game at a friend's house and that he would be back later. And so Karen stayed up for a little while, but then ultimately she went to bed thinking he would be there in the morning. But the next morning when she got up, there was no sign of her husband, and so she went to the police. She told police that her husband had recently told her that he actually thought he might be in danger because he was scheduled to give a deposition in Dallas later that month in a conflict of interest case between his old law firm and a wealthy client. And David was being pressured to cover up some of the wrongdoings of his previous law firm, and he just wasn't willing to do that. While police were certainly intrigued at this new information, they didn't have any evidence to support the idea that someone was actively trying to silence David. It was just a conspiracy. And so for 11 months, they looked for new leads and new information, but nothing came out, and David never popped up. He never called home. There was no sign of him. And so after 11 months, the police decided that David must have left of his own accord and that there was no foul play here, and so they closed the case. But in 2004, a state trooper in Washington State was on the internet just researching unsolved mysteries, and he came across a picture of David Lewis. And immediately he recognized that he looked exactly like an unidentified victim of a hit-and-run case he covered back in 1993. And so he pulled up the details of this hit and run, and he found the victim had been struck a day after David Lewis had gone missing. When this John Doe got hit, he was walking aimlessly down Highway 24 in Washington State, so 1,600 miles away from Amarillo, Texas, where David Lewis had gone missing. But despite the enormous distance between these two events, this trooper was convinced David Lewis was this John Doe. But as he's looking at the picture of David Lewis, he realizes he has glasses, and he didn't think the John Doe was wearing glasses. But just to be sure, he checked the belongings list of the John Doe, and eventually DNA would confirm that David Lewis was the John Doe. Now, this solved the mystery of where David Lewis went, but it did not solve the mystery of why he went there. And if David was the one who hit record on his VCR on the night of the Super Bowl, that means he would have only had less than 24 hours to move 1,600 miles to Washington State without his car. But officially, the police have said David left the house of his own accord, and his death was ruled an accident. 2015, 32-year-old Henry McCabe was living just outside of Minneapolis, Minnesota, with his wife, Corrine, and their 2 daughters. On September 6th, Henry's wife and his 2 kids head out to California to visit with some family, leaving Henry alone. He calls his 2 very close friends, and they decide to go to a nightclub. They get to the nightclub, and Henry very quickly starts drinking a lot of alcohol. The trio would stay at the nightclub till about 2 in the morning, and then when they left, Henry, who had driven there and met his 2 friends at the club, was about to drive himself home when one of his 2 friends said, "Wait a minute, you can't be driving." Henry gets in the car with them, and they start driving to Henry's house. Henry tells them to go to a very specific gas station. He said he wanted to get food and a drink, but the gas station he was trying to go to was 2 miles in the opposite direction away from his house. Henry was really aggressive and very adamant that that was the gas station he wanted to go to, and in fact, "I don't even want you to wait for me. I want you to drop me off. I will get whatever I want, and then I'll walk home." They dropped him off, they watched him go inside, and they turned around and they left. At 2:28 in the morning, Henry's wife, Corrine, looked at her phone and she saw she had a missed call and a voicemail from Henry. On the voicemail, Henry sounds incredibly distressed. He's yelling that he's been shot, and it sounds like he's in pain. And then in the background, you hear this really intense growling sound. And then Henry starts screaming about whatever is growling at him. And then Henry yells out, "Stop it," before the phone cuts out. This is what was made publicly available. Right after Corrine listens to this voicemail, she tries calling Henry, and it goes straight to voicemail. The police go out looking for Henry. They go to his house. He's not there. Look around the gas station. They talk to the attendant. They talk to some people that were there, and no one knows where Henry is. So at this point, the police pull Henry's phone records, and they can see he placed a call to his wife at about 2:23 in the morning, but they can't determine where he was. Then, just a few minutes later, he places another call to his brother, and his brother would report to police that all Henry was doing on the call was just sobbing. And following that call to his brother, he turned his phone off. Several hours later, his phone would turn back on, and it would ping about 4 miles away from this gas station. Then his phone would turn off again. 2 months after Henry goes missing, his body is found in a lake up near the area where his cell phone had last pinged. This area is a very difficult area to access. There's no public access to this lake. There were no injuries to his body. Even though the case was bizarre to everybody involved, they ruled it an accidental drowning. Some say he took his own life. Others say he was just intoxicated and stumbled into the lake and drowned. Neither of those explanations account for the very obvious growling and strange sounds that we heard on his voicemail. To this day, Henry McCabe's death remains a mystery.
In 2014, a disturbing text message conversation between two classmates was uploaded to the internet. Annie and David are talking casually, and then Annie hears footsteps outside and goes to look. She sees someone standing in her yard, and she assumes it's just Dave playing a joke on her, but it's not. Suddenly, the stranger starts sprinting towards her house. He smashes through a window, and now he's in her house. She freaks out, jumps in a closet, and tells Dave to call the police. She tells Dave that he's yelling for her to come out, and then Annie stops texting. When Annie finally writes back that everything's just fine, Dave realizes something. He wasn't talking to Annie anymore. In 2015, a college student was renting the basement apartment of his friend's house. One weekend, his basement roommates take off for the night, so he decides to use that time to get some homework done distraction-free. But as soon as he sits down to do his work, his friend upstairs and his family starts making all this noise, moving furniture around, shuffling feet. It's impossible to focus, so he picks up his phone and he texts his friend. "You guys sound like you're really having a good time up there. I'm not really getting anything done. Can I come up?" And his buddy says, "No one is home. We went to Wisconsin for the weekend." Terrified, he runs out the side door to get a look in the window to see who's making all the noise. All the lights are off in the house. There's not a single car in the driveway. He had been home alone the whole time.
A 35-year-old woman, who we'll call Olivia, met her husband for lunch at a restaurant in western New York. The couple had not originally planned to stay at this restaurant for very long, but one thing led to another. They were having a nice time, and before long, it was 6 p.m., and they had been there for 6 hours. And over those 6 hours, both of them had a lot to eat, lots of bread and pasta and cakes and all sorts of stuff, and they had some alcohol, but not very much. Olivia had been careful to only have 4 drinks over those 6 hours because she wanted to be able to drive. And so after they got the check and they paid for their meal, they both hopped in their respective cars and they began driving home. As Olivia was making her way home, she unfortunately got a flat tire, and so the police show up a few minutes later. They pull up right behind Olivia, and when they get out, they ask her, "Are you okay? Do you need any help?" And she would say, "Oh no, I just had a flat tire. I'm totally fine. Thank you for stopping though." But the police, as they're listening to her speak, they see her eyes look kind of glassy and glazed over like she's drunk, and as she was speaking, they could have sworn she was slurring her words. And so they said, "Hey ma'am, have you been drinking tonight?" And she would tell them that, "Well, yeah, I have had a few drinks, but only 4 over the last 6 hours, and I don't feel drunk at all. That has nothing to do with the situation I'm in now. I'm not drunk." But the police were not buying it, so they made her blow into a breathalyzer. When Olivia blew into this breathalyzer, she fully expected that she would be below the 0.08% legal limit, because after all, she'd only had 4 alcoholic drinks over a 6-hour period, but she blew a staggering 0.33%. The cops couldn't believe what they were looking at, because they're looking at Olivia and they're thinking, at that level, she should be somewhere between losing consciousness and dying, but here she is just standing there talking to us, acting a little bit buzzed. The officers couldn't understand how this woman had such an extreme alcohol tolerance, but regardless, they charged her with driving while intoxicated and then brought her to the hospital for medical intervention. There, her BAC remained high even after a full day had passed without her consuming any more alcohol. This is around the time that it was discovered that Olivia had a very, very rare medical condition called auto-brewery syndrome, which in a nutshell meant her body transformed glucose from foods, specifically carbs like bread, pasta, that kind of thing, into alcohol. Olivia, who was totally unaware of this condition, had developed this wicked alcohol tolerance because she was basically drunk all the time. Not because she was a heavy drinker, but because she ate ate carbs. When Olivia's condition was discovered and made public, the charges against her were dropped and she would go on to just stop eating carbs altogether. At 5 a.m. on June 28, 1988, a 25-year-old man named Jeffrey Link stood in the supply room of a small factory in Auburn, Indiana. He reached up and he grabbed a container on the shelf, and then he turned, left the supply room, and walked out into the main factory area. So the factory where Jeffrey worked was called Bastion Plating Company, and what they did is they made chrome-plated parts for cars. And Jeffrey's specific job was being a machine operator. This job that Jeffrey did was actually pretty dangerous. The machines they worked on were big industrial machines that often got really hot. So on this particular day, Jeffrey reached the machine that he was going to be performing maintenance on. And this machine was huge. And the only way for him to actually perform maintenance was to get inside of the machine. Jeffrey, with this container he had gotten from the supply room, stepped inside. A few seconds later, one of Jeffrey's colleagues hears a loud thud sound coming from where Jeffrey is. And he turns and he looks into the opening of this machine where Jeffrey had gone, and he sees what appears to be Jeffrey just lying on the ground inside of this machine. And as he's watching, another coworker runs into the machine where Jeffrey is. And this second coworker who rushes into the machine with Jeffrey just suddenly collapses as well, right next to Jeffrey. And then two more colleagues come running over. They go into the machine and they too collapse. All four people are just down inside of this machine. And so the coworker who's out on this walkway, they run out of the factory and they call 911. When they come back inside to see what's happening in here, before first responders have arrived here, this is just like seconds later, and he sees now there's like 20 other of his coworkers that have sort of begun congregating in this area near this machine, and they're all stumbling around, they're all disoriented, people are vomiting. It would not be until later, when authorities were able to go into this factory with proper protective equipment on, that they could actually examine this machine that Jeffrey had been trying to do maintenance on, and also they examined the container that Jeffrey had brought with him into that machine. So the machine that Jeffrey was performing maintenance on was a huge metal tank that had recently been used to store a chemical called zinc cyanide. And so it was going to be Jeffrey's job to go inside of this tank, literally, and clean the inside of it. And so that container he brought with him from the supply room was a chemical cleaning solution. However, the factory had two distinct types of chemical cleaning solutions. Jeffrey knew that. He just accidentally grabbed the wrong one. And when this wrong chemical cleaning solution interacted with the residue of the zinc cyanide inside of that tank, it pretty much immediately created a cloud of poisonous hydrogen cyanide gas. 39 people were hospitalized from this poisonous gas. And of those 39 people, 5 people died, including Jeffrey, 3 people who rushed in immediately to try to help him and passed out next to him, as well as 1 additional coworker.